Welcome to B2B Commerce Corner. Commerce Corner is a sub-series of the E-Commerce Edge podcast discussing all things B2B commerce through the lens of agencies, consultants, merchants, and more. Enjoy. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the E-Commerce Edge podcast. I've got a very special guest lined up for you today, and he is Mr. Graham LUBIE from Wasserman Digital. Welcome, Graham.
Hi.
It's nice to see you again. We were able to catch up very briefly, not as long as I would have liked. I was being pulled in a million different directions at the recent B2B Online Florida event, but that's the first time we've had a chance to even shake hands in person, and it was really good to see you there. But we wanted to have a conversation. I think there was a lot of unfinished business in Florida. And look, I love the B2B online events, but I also love when I can take the relationships that I'm able to make at those events and take them further after the event and get to know people a little bit better. So thank you for joining me today for the conversation.
Happy to be here. And it's always nice to be able to chat with people that you've gone back and forth online with and in different social media channels and actually put a conversation together when everything's just been typed out.
Yeah, look, and I've been a fan of yours. I've seen a lot of your content on LinkedIn. You're obviously pretty well known in our industry, even though I hadn't formally met you in person before. You're doing good things. You've been in this game for a very long time. This is not your first rodeo over at Wasserman, but before we get into that, you've been over at Wasserman for nearly 12 years now, so it's definitely not your first rodeo, that's for sure. And if we look back at the history of kind of your work, starting out at Accenture and then getting into, you've been in leadership positions, like senior digital leadership positions for virtually your entire career. But what initially drew you into this space to begin with? What interested you about being in this space?
I started, so as you point out, I started out with Accenture thinking I'd be getting into strategy consulting as a consultant, and found out very quickly that at the time Accenture required all of their consultants to do some level of programming. And I got sucked into that. I absolutely loved the system components, working with clients on data flows between their different systems, understanding business requirements, and figuring out how we could use technology to bridge the gap between the needs and the end results. And since then, my whole career has been focused on that intersection point between technology and business. And e-commerce is probably one of the more complex and more exciting areas. So it's been a thread throughout my career.
I love that. And you've obviously done the marketing side as well, and you've filled out your career with many different facets and lenses on digital. But the one through line I think that I really like about what you just said is the fact that for me, my career has been focused very much on the technical and operational side of digital, more so the tech, the ops, the people, the data. Those areas have been the focus for most of my career. Got into senior solution architecture more laterally in my career, full stack across the whole of the commerce stack, not just e-commerce, ERP, CRM, CDP, PIM, point of sale. And what I love about this is that there's not that many of us. For you, obviously, you came from a programming background, and I didn't. So I'm a very technical non-programmer. So I can still read API documentation. I still speak the language of developers so that I can have great conversations with them and worked very closely with developers throughout the whole of my career. But and even with this podcast, I found when I started this podcast, most truly great e-commerce podcasts going back 4 or 5 years ago, they were focused almost exclusively on merchant stories and digital marketing, but not the tech and ops side of e-commerce and not the organizational design, process design, none of those more complex aspects of digital that doesn't often get a lot of airtime. And did you find that as you started to move more towards the strategy side, more towards the leadership side of digital, did you find that your technical background served you super well as you moved more into that side of it?
I think having the tech background's always helped out, mostly because it has allowed me to understand what it takes to deliver a digital transformation. So start out with Accenture, a lot of the projects were large. First one was with an airline building custom client server systems. After that, worked on a very large Oracle ERP implementation for a telecom. And each of those projects had people, process, technology, all intertwined together. And those have stood me, I think, in really good stead in how I approach projects and how I work with our clients on their projects, to realize it's not just a e-commerce platform that you're implementing. You're doing a business change. And that business change has the e-commerce platform, but it's got a lot around it that you have to take into account.
No question about it. I know that, like, when I was still working brand side and as an e-commerce manager and we were doing large scale change management, I stayed in those roles in some cases longer than I would have otherwise, because I wanted to be able to see, instead of just being a theorist, I wanted to also be a doist. And I wanted to actually see
Yeah.
what change of this scale looked like from beginning to end, all the way from concept and solution design, all the way through the full scoping exercise, adoption planning, test planning, change management, absolutely everything from soup to nuts. I wanted to be able to say, I have done this. I haven't just architected it. I haven't just talked about it. I haven't just consulted on it. I want to actually be at the tip of the spear doing this and leading change management over multiple years and a very large program
Yeah.
of work. And I tell you, when you're in it, it is a very different feeling when you have to be the champion, because there's such a thing as project fatigue, and it's a real thing. People lose hope, they lose faith mid-project when you're deep in the weeds and you're running your 2 weekly sprint planning and everything else. It feels almost interminable at times. It feels like, are we ever going to get this thing live? And people, even team members come and go, people leave the business, and especially if you're the main champion, it's a test of will more than anything else at times, isn't it?
100% agree with that, especially when we're in the midst of a project. You've gone through your initial strategy and your requirements gathering, and you're starting to actually develop, and you're doing your interim milestone deliverables, and you come across these new requirements that suddenly are bubbling up. And that can be
Yes.
tiring. It's like, oh, not another requirement popping up that we
Another
didn't
change
discover
request.
over the last 6 months. Yeah. And frankly, I don't like change requests, because it means that at some point in the process, we didn't capture the requirements, or the client didn't surface those requirements to us, and we couldn't plan for them. So it introduces variability into the project. And variability is one of the things that you just mentioned, I think, causes project fatigue when there are a lot of changes that come along the way.
Yeah, and I think it's also a challenge when the client can sometimes say mid-project, when, and it was always a debate, because I've run and built agencies too. I haven't just worked brand side, I haven't just been a consultant, but I've run and built agencies and had my own e-commerce pure play in the beginning of my career too. So I've seen it through a lot of different lenses, luckily. But oftentimes it was a debate whenever I was building and running agencies. It was always a debate what scale of change request was worth raising to the client as a formal change request, because you've got to pick and choose your battles. Because sometimes when you go to them with a change request, it's, you're the experts, you should have seen this coming, you should have known that this was a requirement, you should have raised this with us in the beginning, why are you raising this with us now? Sometimes there's a debate about how much you should have known as maybe the consultant or the agency, versus how much they should take ownership of that they didn't surface to you as a requirement. And so there is this tension, there's this constant tension sometimes between long-term partnerships. It's like a marriage in many respects, especially these long-term programs of work, maybe not just these standalone projects, but definitely when you're getting into large-scale programs of work and large-scale change management. There is this delicate dance that happens between partners and their clients that says, okay, at what scale does something need to be a change and formalized as a change to scope, which is going to impact budget, impact timelines, and we need to have this conversation with the client, and are they going to be receptive of those discussions? And they aren't always.
100% agree with that. And I think we're aligned in how you look at relationships, and we do. We're in it for the long term. So there's always going to be some give and take on the projects. And they are right to expect that we're bringing a perspective to the engagement of experience. We do dozens of them a year. We do dozens of projects. We do dozens of requirements gathering and requirements documentation sessions with clients a year. Whereas it could be with a lot of the clients, it's the first time they're ever doing one. So we are expected to bring that knowledge base to the engagements. And along with that knowledge base, it's composed of our team, which is typically pretty experienced e-commerce professionals and consultants. Many have been on both sides of the table, consultants as well as practitioners. But it's also our toolkits of requirements gathering templates and methodologies that help us limit the misses rather than assume you're never going to miss a requirement. That's just not realistic, especially in large systems and large scale transformations. But it's how do you minimize the opportunity for missing.
Yeah, I have a saying that I've relied on for many years, which is you ask better questions, you get better answers. And so for me, I pride myself on, I'd like to think that I have, after 24 years of doing this, I'd like to think that I have one of the most robust discovery processes in the game. And it starts out with a questionnaire before we even get into workshops and trying to get like a baseline of knowledge and information from the client, because oftentimes they've got to circulate this internally across many members of a team before they can even get the information back into your hands. And then following up with workshops. I'm working with a recent client, and they're one of the largest industrial belt manufacturers in the United States, a very well-known household name brand. And we did the initial questionnaire, sent that through. They had to circulate that around their team. And then we had 9 follow-up deep dive workshops with different teams within their business to cover all aspects of current state, understanding where the gaps are, what the desired future state looks like, and kind of how we're going to bridge the gap to get there. And one of the things that I find helps cut through the noise, and I'd love your thoughts on this. So a lot of times clients want to jump straight to the tech. Like they go, what's the tech we're going to use? What tech are we going to select? How are we going to architect it? What's this going to do? What is it going to do for us in our business? And they jump straight to that place. And I'm like, why don't we, instead of thinking of it through purely a technical lens, let me and people like me and the geeks and the devs and everybody else, let us worry about the technology and think about the technology and the solution design. And why don't we work backwards from the experience you want to create and the feelings you want to create with your customers? Why don't we think about that first? And have you even done any customer interviews? Have you done any internal interviews to assess what challenges, for example, in the B2B world, what challenges are your sales reps and your inside sales teams having with customers that they know their customers are having challenges doing business with you, and that they get these constant requests and questions on a regular basis? And when we start from that place, the vision usually becomes a lot clearer than when you start from a place of technical knowledge or discussion. Do you find a similar approach can work well to cut through the noise, and it removes the opportunity for the hippo, the highest paid person in the room, to dominate the discussion with what they think is important at the time?
I 100% buy into the idea. Start with your requirements and what you want to achieve before you choose the technology you're going to use to achieve it. 100% buy into that. And in today's market, we do see quite a lot of companies coming to us saying, we've chosen this platform.
Yes.
Help us implement it. And it's just the nature of the way that I think that the platform marketing and SaaS solution and e-commerce marketing works today, where customers are getting sold on a platform with the expectation that the platform is the best one for their requirements. Sometimes it is.
Yes.
Sometimes it's not. And I like the projects. I like the projects when they come with the platform selected, but I also like the projects where we're able to help understand how they're going to have a differentiated strategy compared to their competitors, what the features they need to have that differentiated strategy, and then use that to drive the selection. As an example, yesterday, I was on a call with one of our clients. They're a distributor in the safety space, really innovative. They've got physical locations. They've got an online presence. They are essentially hitting all of the e-commerce channels. They have EDI, they have Punch-Out, they have customer sales reps that will accept phone calls as well as attach PDFs in emails, and they have portals and their website. The portals and the website side of the house is actually a smaller part of their overall business, but it's growing because what they're doing is they're white labeling purchasing portals for their customers with single sign, customer price lists, all built on their e-commerce platform. So for them, their goal is to strategically be the easiest to work with provider in their space, And in order to do that, they feel like they have to make a seamless experience for their end customers, to employees to buy. It's all B2B. So it's tied into single sign on the customer organizations. It's got customer price lists. Customers are using their own shipping accounts. So and everything's purchased on terms. Very few credit
Yes.
cards get put down. So that to me is a strategic vision that not every platform is going to be able to deliver on. Let's figure out your strategy, then figure out the technology.
Yeah, if I had $1 for every single time a customer said, "Man, I wish we'd have met you before we signed this contract." The number of times that I have heard that, where I'm called in to effectively rescue a project or try to architect a way out of a project or into a project, or to supplement a chosen technology because it doesn't do everything that's needed in the business. And where maybe they've signed a 3 to 5 year contract in some instances, so they're locked into this solution whether they like it or not. And that's not just e-commerce technologies either. That's ERPs, it's CRMs, it's heavy duty enterprise class systems that I was dealing with. This is going back a couple of years now, but I was dealing with a auto parts. It was a 4-wheel drive parts seller down in Australia, and they did both B2B and B2C and D2C. So they did some design and manufacturing of their own products. They did distribution of some of their own products. They were also a distributor for other people's products. Plus, they had physical store locations as well. So they had all the channels going on, and they also sold through marketplaces as well. So they had everything going on all at the same time. Oh, and they also did 4-wheel drive wrecking. They had wrecking yards that they owned as well. So they sold some secondhand parts in addition to brand new parts. And they had just implemented, just before I got to them, because I was helping them with their digital transformation from an e-com perspective. They had only been live on their dealer management system / ERP for 6 months by the time I got to them. Their ERP system had no APIs. And so they wanted to do all this digital transformation across their business, and it was very reliant on this back office system that kind of ran everything. It ran their point of sale, it ran their wrecking business, it ran their retail business, it ran their wholesale business, it had all price lists in it. It did everything for them from a back office perspective. It ran all their credit control, everything, and had no APIs. And it was like pulling hen's teeth to even get time with anyone technical on the vendor's side of this technology to be able to help us even understand how we could get data in and out of the system. It ended up being an SFTP server with CSVs in and CSVs out and cron jobs. And it was an absolute nightmare of a project, simply because they had selected, because one of my first questions when I got to them and I learned how difficult it was going to be to integrate this system into the rest of their stack, I said, how averse would you be to this system that you run in the back? Is that open to discussion, or is that a sacred cow that we don't talk about, that we don't touch? And they said, considering we've only been live with it for 6 months and we put a significant amount of money into implementing it, that's staying. It's staying for at least 5 years, so we can get some sense of ROI out of it before we would even think about anything else. Okay, cool. It's a sacred cow. We don't talk about that. We would just have to figure out a way to work around it. And this is not the first time I've seen this. And so to your point, I think you ask better questions, you get better answers. And if they would have just been in the position when they were vetting back office systems to ask about system integration capabilities, and if that would have been one of the core requirements, that system was easily integratable with everything else, it would have made their lives infinitely easier with every subsequent system that they implemented, but they didn't know the questions to ask. So they were asking, does it do this? Does it manage dismantling? Does it manage point of sale? And they were looking at it purely through the lens of their current state business and saying, does it do all the things we need to do, but not some of the future state things that they wanted to do. And that was the fatal flaw in their planning.
Challenging situation. I think a lot of companies are dealing with technical debt.
Yes.
Their debt's new. A lot of the customers that we work with have either legacy custom-built ERP systems that have had feature upon feature added to them, or they've got off-the-shelf products that have just been around for a long time. We've got a couple of customers that are running AS400 servers with some pretty gnarly technology on them. And with some of them, we rely on file exports and cron jobs to to leverage the data that they've got. Others, we've built custom
Yes.
ODBC drivers, plug into the back end and actually extract it out of the databases. Where there's a will, there's a way. It's just sometimes more challenging than you might like.
Yeah, and are you guys like, what would the split now where you guys are at in your business growth? Where are you guys at on the spectrum of split between, say, B2C, D2C merchants, B2B merchants, and sort of the scale of merchant that you would typically deal with? Is it like the $50 million GMV a year plus merchants you're dealing with, $100 million or more? What are the typical scale of clients you're dealing with, and how many systems would they typically have in play as part of their business stack?
We've got a pretty broad spectrum of customers. On the answering the first question of B2B versus B2C, we've got more B2C customers. Our B2B customers tend to be larger and much more complex.
Yeah.
So with our direct-to-consumer customers that are Sabrina Carpenter's fragrance site is something that we built and launched last year. That sort of site, it's beautiful, highly designed, really functional, great revenues running through it for the client, but it's fairly simple. You don't have a lot of the complexity of a B2B site. We've got other clients, such as the safety product company that I mentioned, that has a lot of client accounts, customer accounts, and a lot of complexity goes into maintaining and integrating into their ERP system as well. So more B2C clients, but bigger, more complex B2B accounts.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why I made a conscious decision when I started my consultancy, because for the first 3/4 of my career, I was focused solely on or almost exclusively on the B2C, D2C world from an e-com perspective and a solution architecture and design pattern perspective. But when I looked back, like when I first started my consultancy, and I thought, okay, what market do I want to go after? Because niching down, in my experience, is a superpower, and it's something that not everybody can do. And it always feels like you're giving away opportunity. The more you niche down and the more you get very specific on the types of services that you want to offer and what your ICP looks like, the narrower that becomes, that makes a lot of entrepreneurs panic, because it feels like I'm giving away all this opportunity. The more I niche down, the more opportunities I say no to. But I found that the more I've niched down, the better, stronger, faster, more efficient my business has become. And actually, I've become more well-known for those specific suite of services that I offer in the niches that I offer them. And it's actually led to a stronger, better business as a result, and a more sustainable business for me. And I knew pretty much at the outset that B2C, D2C consulting was an absolute red ocean affair. Everybody and their dog does B2C and D2C consulting. And everybody and their dog does Shopify consulting. And everybody and their dog does Klaviyo consulting. And everybody and their dog deals with the D2C stack, right? The typical D2C stack. And then when I paired that thought with the fact that when I look back across my career, all of the most exciting, most challenging, most complex projects that I had dealt with in my career were the B2B projects. And I thought that lends itself to a more blue ocean opportunity, because there's not a lot of us that specialize in the B2B world, combined with they have the most interesting, engaging, challenging things that they're dealing with in terms of digital transformation. That feels like a match made in heaven. And so for me, B2B felt like a natural home for somebody that's really technical, but also really loves the business aspects of what we do.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. The B2B has been something that we've worked on extensively for close to a decade. One of our projects over probably 5 years ago, we built a module for purchase order approvals, very B2B functionality, right? Where somebody can place a purchase order request, it gets routed to their manager or their manager's manager based on buy-in rules. And they can then approve, reject, modify that. That was built on Adobe Commerce. It was Adobe Magento at the time, before they even launched Adobe Commerce. Adobe bought it from us and has rolled it into the stack as part of the Adobe Commerce purchase order approval. So we've been working with pretty gnarly B2B problems for quite a while. And it's exciting. It's interesting work because you're getting that intersection of business and tech coming together. How can we use technology to solve a business problem? How can we help our customers facilitate the buying process in their organization? So I'm 100% in on the B2B space.
Yeah, and for me, one of the other things, God love them, but marketers, hell's bells. When you're in the B2C and D2C world, historically, the vast majority of time we were engaged with marketing teams. They were significant drivers of the requirements definition of any major D2C or B2C project. And in fact, in many instances, the commerce teams were situated underneath from a reporting perspective to a marketing manager or a head of marketing or a CMO or something like that. And so not always, but frequently that was the case. And so I found that in the D2C and B2C projects, I was oftentimes dealing with very technical people. And that is very challenging when you're talking about a technical solution and you're trying to dumb it down enough to where it makes sense to them and it connects with them and you can help them understand how technology can help support their marketing initiatives and vice versa. But without, you also don't want to come across as condescending. And that's a very fine line to walk in the B2C and D2C world. And I find that now that I'm working almost exclusively in the B2B world, I'm dealing with operators. I'm dealing with heads of sales. I'm dealing with heads of IT. I'm dealing with the COO of the business. I'm dealing with people in logistics. I'm dealing with business systems managers, for example, because we're dealing with ERPs. So I find that I'm dealing with operators more often in the B2B world than marketers. And in fact, some of the B2B businesses that I work with, they don't have a marketing team. They might have a marketing manager, but they have a sales team and they've got a sales manager or maybe a head of RevOps or something like that, but they don't
Yeah.
necessarily have a big traditional marketing function in the business that I'm having to liaise with and get the rubber stamp of approval from. And I find that is one of the additional benefits of working in the B2B world is you're truly dealing with operators of the business. And that's a really exciting place to be.
Yeah, that's actually something I noticed at the B2B Online event is the majority of the titles were not marketing or e-commerce.
Yes.
There was something else. It could be sales, it could be transformation, it could be IT, it could be operations, it's just a wide variety of titles, very different from what you might see at a eTail East or an eTail West type of conference, which are typically going to be a lot
Yes.
more marketing
Yes.
centric.
And I found that the conversations
So,
that we're able to have at something like B2B Online, they're much more deep in nature as opposed to what's the shiny, because marketers, again, God love them, marketers break everything, right? That's their goal. It's to how can we exploit the sexiest new channel and the sexiest new sales opportunity. And so marketers oftentimes snap at the newest, shiniest thing because they have to, whereas operational people that are more operationally minded or operational in nature and their function is more operational in nature, they're thinking through all the complexities of what it's going to take to get this done in the business for their customers. And that's quite a different mindset to how can we market ourselves better, isn't it?
yeah. Yeah, I would say that a lot of the direct to consumer customers that we have are sophisticated. They understand how e-commerce fits within their overall go-to-market strategy. It's one of the channels most of them deal with. They're typically selling on marketplaces. Some of them are omni-channel. Some of them are selling through distributors as well. Uh, a lot of ours tend to be pretty sophisticated users of technology and e-commerce, but they also have a high expectation that the e-commerce site is going to perform and it's going to help drive revenues and it's going to help drive customer intimacy and brand identity. So they're just two different sorts of projects. I think one is how do we make sure that we're really driving conversions for those visitors coming to the site, and yeah, we obviously want to build the relationship. Versus on the B2B side, you've typically got a relationship, and how do you serve the customer better with that relationship? Which goes to the idea of what metrics are you going to manage as well. The idea of tracking conversion rates on B2B is, in our world,
Well,
much
I
less
usually don't even
important.
get, it's more like how can we, when they talk, their equivalent of conversion rate usually is how can we transition customers from putting all their orders through a sales rep, for example, or customer service, how can we transition them to doing more transactions digitally? And what does that transition rate look like over time? That's what they're looking for, as opposed to going, hey, can we increase our conversion rate? So they speak even a completely different language, usually.
I totally agree. And with a lot of the B2B customers we work with, they have customers
Yes.
that have price lists. Those price lists are set up as discounts of the catalog list price in exchange for expectations of
Correct.
volume purchasing. And that volume purchasing often means that they're the sole source for the purchase. So when somebody's come to the site, they're not shopping for which color t-shirt do I want and which style. They're looking for a product, and the conversion rate is going to be close to 100% if they can find it. So it's just such an interesting, different dynamic and different levers to pull to drive.
Well, and also some of the other things that from the B2B side are so very different is oftentimes on the B2C and D2C world, they want dwell times to be higher. They want time on site to be higher. One of the metrics is how can we cross-sell? How can we upsell? How can we create an inspirational buying experience? How can we create a shopping journey that is woven throughout? We want to merge content and commerce together so that there's more of an aspirational element to the shopping journey. How can we get our basket sizes to be bigger? How can we get them to purchase more frequently? How can we remarket to them? The whole goal of how a customer interacts with your site and for how long oftentimes is radically different between the B2C world and the B2B world. In the B2B world, oftentimes we're actually incentivized to get them in and out of the website experience faster, not slower, because we want to reduce the friction of being able to populate a cart with maybe 50 line items or 100 line items and 1,000 units of a product, right? And it's how can we make that process faster and easier and more frictionless for the buyer, because they're not coming there to be inspired. They're coming there to complete a job because they are employed to buy products from you. So they're coming there to buy. They're not coming there to browse or be inspired. They're coming there to make a purchase. And the faster and easier that they can do that and get back to something else more productive in their day, the better off you're going to be with them. And it's so even the goals of what the customer does when they get to the site are so very different.
Yeah, a lot of what we're actually looking at is, and working with clients on, is not just making the purchase. It's making sure the customer has the information they need to make the purchase. Because for a lot of our customers, they sell products that, say, go into a large office construction. They're selling plumbing equipment. And that plumbing equipment needs to get spec'd into their designs months before it gets purchased. So when somebody comes to the site, we need to make sure that they've got the most up-to-date information possible, and they can use that in a CAD drawing when they're doing their designs, because sometimes that order is not going to come directly to the manufacturer. It's going to go through a distributor that is buying from the manufacturer and then distributing. So the idea of e-commerce in B2B is obviously very relevant, but there are multi-touch points in that buying cycle, and the customer portal, the customer buying site, often needs to serve the needs of those that are researching and speccing, as well as those that are actually transacting.
Well, and in that scenario, to your point, there's oftentimes regulatory governance and compliance aspects of the data that they have to consider as well. So if you're not providing that type of information, then you can't be in the consideration set for a given project. And so if you don't have great product data that says, okay, if it's a pump or maybe it's an outlet or a power panel or something like that, there's heavy duty, or if it's a steel beam and we need to know the load carrying capability of a steel beam for a specific construction requirement, if you don't have that data available, that is either going to put you completely out of consideration, or it's going to put a lot of work back on your sales reps and sales teams to get that data as supplemental data into the customer's hands so that they can make the purchase, which kind of defeats the purpose of having a portalized experience where you should be able to do this communication on a one-to-many basis instead of a one-to-one basis. And this is part of the educational process, I find. I'm as much of a coach and a psychologist and an educator as I am a strategist or a solution architect when I go in and I'm talking to these B2B brands in particular, because they just, many times, they do not know what's possible. They just do. So I find that discovery there's oftentimes a lot of mini consulting sessions that go on as part of the discovery process, because I'm tasked just as much with helping them define their requirements as gathering them and documenting them. So, but they have to know what's possible before, and they have to know what's going to be required internally to be able to get them to a place where they can implement or improve these digital channels before they can take advantage of the capabilities of the technology. And oftentimes that comes down to product data or customer data and all the lack thereof of it being in formats and structured and organized in such a way that it can become a one-to-many distribution channel.
Yeah. And it's also interesting working in some of the ingredients types of industries, being able to do things like certificates of analysis or batches of product that are tied to specific orders, and being able to have that batch information, which is nothing you ever see on a B2C site, right? And people are coming to get that information months after the purchase was placed. So being able to have that easily linked between your back-end operational systems, your e-commerce site, your customer portal becomes really valuable. It's not a transaction, but it's definitely tied to your
or
revenue.
Serialized products, for example, and having to be able to provide warranty support linked back to that original purchase and that original specific unit of a specific item from a specific lot, from a specific pallet. Like there are, to your point, even if a B2B customer buys off of you via EDI or punch out or some sort of automated transactional solution, they need a whole suite of digital services provided to them way beyond the transaction. And I think sometimes when I go into these conversations, I'm brought in, help us deliver e-commerce. But then it's, hang on a second, what are all the other things that your customer expects for you other than the buy button on an e-commerce website? Is it CPQ capabilities that they require and they want that to be digitalized? Do they want to be able to digitalize their entire returns process? Do they want to be able to track their shipments from your warehouse to their warehouse because they have a receipting team that has to be scheduled to receipt a pallet or a container of goods at a specific time, and we have to have the space in our dock to be able to receipt these goods? We've got so many more considerations other than just the transaction. And increasingly, our EDI and punch out customers still expect all those other rich digital services, regardless of how they actually buy or pay you, right?
Totally. And a lot of the expectations we're working with our customers that it doesn't matter how somebody places the order. There are expectations of how do I minimize the calls to my customer support team when somebody's looking for that certificate of analysis? How do I give customers the tracking information without them having to call me for it? And by the way, there are lots of tracking numbers that the person's getting every single day. It's difficult for them to find the right tracking number tied to the right order if they don't log in and look for the specific order information. So those sorts of tools, I believe, provide a bridge from offline ordering, I'll call it offline ordering, but it's like EDI or punch out or whatever else, into a portal where a customer can log in and see all the information that is relevant to them, and without having to call a sales rep. And that's difficult because very often the e-commerce stores are placing an order, but in the B2B world, that order edited, updated, changed. You've got different shipping at different times. You've got invoicing versus credit card payments. It's really difficult to sync that data back into the e-commerce system, which I think is where the concept of the customer portals becomes very valuable.
Yeah, and what's interesting is in the B2C and D2C world, you never have to, for example, order sync in the B2C and D2C world between an e-commerce website and, say, an ERP or an OMS or WMS or whatever it might be, or a CRM or whatever it might be. It's a one-way sync. There is no two-way update required, right, on that, except for maybe obviously fulfillment information flowing back into the commerce system to trigger transactional emails or whatever it might be. But there's very rarely, or maybe an order cancellation, but very rarely do you need to completely update everything about an order like you do in the B2B world. Because although an order in the B2B world might be order received via an e-commerce channel, say, for example, that is not, it's very rare that is how the order is actually going to be processed and shipped. Oftentimes there's unit number changes, there's SKU deprecation and substitution, there's there is a million different things that happen to a B2B order by the time it's actually received in the ERP, but then it goes into processing into the order management process and assigned out to the different warehouses for fulfillment or whatever it might be. There's a whole lot of things that can happen in between times. And so two-way sync of orders and all order data is the de facto standard in the B2B world. It is not the de facto standard in the B2B world.
Absolutely, because it's really difficult. Very often you've got, as you said, you've got different ways of processing that data in the ERP than is going to be displayed in the commerce side. And I think we had a conversation about it, or maybe you had mentioned this, but having a view into the ERP, your ERP essentially becomes your system of record. So rather than trying to sync the data between the two systems, have a view from your customer portal into your ERP. So you've always got up-to-date information around those orders. And your invoices are going to match to what the customer actually gets, rather than trying to have those invoices aligned with whatever's done in the e-commerce
Yeah,
system.
but then I find that a two-way actual sync, as opposed to just maybe an embedded iframe or something like that into the ERP, I find that an actual two-way updated sync into the actual e-commerce system becomes important too, so that customers can continue to interact with that order after it's been fulfilled. So they can go in and they can actually open the order in the commerce system. They can click on the items in the commerce system, be taken to the PDPs of those products, or be able to reorder directly from that historic order, or be able to create a shopping list from that order for approval from a buying manager or something like that. So it's a really tricky one, especially when orders maybe are placed external to the commerce system. So you want to be able to see those orders, but unless they were placed in the commerce system and then re-updated from a third-party system, it makes interactivity with those historic orders or orders placed through other channels much more difficult, because now those orders don't exist. They don't necessarily have the associated or linked product ID in the commerce system. So there's and this is, we're getting into the weeds a little bit here, but my point being is that, just generally speaking, B2B commerce workflows, both the sales workflows, the support workflows, the level of product data detail and collateral that has to go along with a product in the B2B world oftentimes is much more complex. Like, you're not going to get an MSDS in the B2C. You're not going to get a material safety data sheet in the B2C world to complete a transaction. It's very rare that you'd have to think about that. You're not going to need an exploded drawing with a parts diagram usually to complete a transaction in the B2C or D2C world, but that's very common in the B2B world. You don't have to think about all of these additional data sets and data points. We even have, where there's an equivalent data set, oftentimes the way that they're linked together in the B2B world is very different. In the B2C world, product is an attribute, price is an attribute of the product. In the B2B world, price is an attribute of the customer. So even the data modeling and the way that we meaningfully make that available to the customer is so very different to remove friction from the buying process.
Absolutely. But that's also part of the interesting part of the work. It's not just cookie cuttering is a direct-to-consumer site with the exact same tools every single time, but a different user experience. It's being able to really understand the business requirements and working with the client and figure out, how is the data going to flow? How are we going to give your end customers a materially better experience that will differentiate you from your competitors?
It is, and that's what makes this game fun. Now, as we come down to the end of our time together, it's been a fantastic conversation, and I've really enjoyed it. You've been in this game a very long time, so to being able to speak to an old hand at this is a privilege for me. I feel very lucky to be able to have a conversation with somebody like you. What did COVID, from your perspective and through your lens, what did COVID do to the B2B world? Because from my lens, it put rocket fuel underneath the need for digital capabilities in the B2B world, unlike I had ever seen before. And that's tailed off a little bit, but now businesses are getting down to the hard work of actually doing the proper architecture for a lot of things that they want to do in the future. And I see that the long-term benefit to COVID to the B2B world is it caused a lot of these businesses to get real digital religion in ways that I think it would have been difficult to get any other way.
I see that in the B2B space, company purchasing cycles are usually not spur of the moment, right? It's, you are planning 3-5 years out. I think COVID initiated some of the planning cycles that we're starting to see people really assembling their teams, or over the last year, we saw people assembling their teams, starting to initiate the projects, getting them budgeted for 24, 25, 26. So I see a lot more of that happening right now. We've seen a lot more B2B sales cycles happening, where we're getting asked for proposals, where we're helping customers select platforms. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think COVID initiated that, but it's also slower than, say, the uptake of B2C projects during COVID, where it was very easy to initiate a project. B2B takes a lot more coordination.
Certainly does, because of all those additional systems oftentimes in the back end to think about too. So it's not we're not just dealing with marketing, we're dealing with so many other teams within the business and so many other integrated components as part of the stack. So you might have one integrated or two integrated endpoints in B2C land. You might have 6 integrated endpoints in the B2B world. That's what keeps it. There's never a dull moment in the B2B world, that's for sure. And that's what I love about it. And that's what I love when I get to talk about people that are as experienced as you. That's what I love. It lights my fire, and I absolutely love it. Now, listen, I'll drop your LinkedIn link into the show notes, as well as the Wasserman Digital link into the show notes. But other than that, if people want to have a conversation with you about this whole digital transformation thing, and they want to learn from your experience and just have a conversation with you, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
LinkedIn is probably the best, or if you go to digital.teamwas.com and fill out the form there, can definitely connect.
Absolutely love it. Now, as we do come down to the end of our time together, this is where I get to flip the script, hand the microphone over to you, let you ask me one question. Any question you like, can be personal or professional. So, Mr. Graham LUBIE, what is your question for me today?
Probably around project success, or the obstacles to project success. When you're looking at the projects you've worked on, what is the one thing that you see consistently in projects that are successful versus the ones that aren't?
Great question. There's 2 things that I've identified, particularly on the B2B side, that is just a consistent thing over and over again. Lack of adoption planning in the B2B world is extreme. And by extreme, I don't think I have yet to work with a B2B seller, manufacturer, wholesaler, distributor that has done extensive adoption, both internal and external customer adoption planning before they meet me. I don't think I've ever run into a customer that has done extensive customer interviews, customer discussions. Hey, what would you like from us? What's painful about doing business with us today? What things can we fix to make your life better? That they very rarely have they had deep internal discussions with sales teams to find out what's painful about their job and assessing what part of your job is admin versus actual value delivery for the customer, and trying to ferret that out and say, look, we're going to automate these pieces, but we're going to let you continue to do these pieces to build relationships with our customers. There's just such an extreme lack of adoption planning that oftentimes that's the first thing I encourage my clients to do when they meet me, because I'm like, we're staring down the barrel of maybe a $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 project here, whatever it might end up being. Do we really want to go into this with an unknown level of adoption, with an unknown plan for our customers to adopt these solutions so that we see some form of ROI or time to value on this massive internal investment that we're making on this? Or do we want to have a reasonably high level of certainty that these will see adoption because we've had the conversations we need to have beforehand? Then the second thing is lack of executive buy-in to digital projects is still an issue in the B2B world. Some B2B sellers, they know they need to do it. They're getting asked by their customers to do it. Their customers are literally holding a gun to their head in some instances and saying, unless you offer us some form of digital automation for our buying processes, we're going somewhere else because it's costing us 1%, 2%, 3% extra to do business with you versus your competitor who offers us digital capabilities, right? Or we're going to negotiate with you a lower price on our products that we buy from you to compensate for the extra work we have to do from our side to buy from you. And this is something that at the highest levels, sometimes of these second and third generation family businesses, the parents and grandparents of the people running the businesses today are still involved in the business. And if they don't get it, they can be a massive handbrake on digital transformation. And I hate to say it, and it's going to sound ageist and sexist and everything else, but unfortunately in the B2B world, there's still a lot of male, pale, and stale decision making. And it's a problem. And fortunately, there are some people in that side of the business that are aging out and they're retiring or they're moving on to something else. And so we're getting true digital natives in the business now. And that is probably the most exciting thing. The transition that I'm seeing is more digital natives moving into the B2B world. And that is super exciting for me because that's going to dramatically increase the rate of change, particularly in B2B. Thank
Good
you.
answer.
Listen, I really appreciate your time. This was super enjoyable for me, and I can't wait to speak to you again soon. Thank you for your time. Are you a B2B or D2C e-commerce merchant? Then head over to greenwoodconsulting.net to learn how we can help you scale your business.